Coming up next, we'll have Professor Sandra McNally to share her views on skill development and economic growth in VPET. Professor McNally is the Director of Centre of Vocational Education Research in the London School of Economics and Political Science of the United Kingdom.
Her recent work includes evaluation of government policies in relation to literacy. Currently, she is a co-editor of the Economics of Education Review and a research fellow of ESA Bonn. Let's welcome Professor McNally.
Thank you very much. To start with, I just want to say what a pleasure it is and a privilege it is for me to be here, and to thank the organisers for inviting me to this wonderful event. I'm an economist, and this centre that I run is funded by the Department for Education for 3 to 5 years, where we've been asked to do economic research using quantitative methods to use the data sets that they have, especially within England, to help policy makers decide what to do and to try to inform the policy making process. So this talk that I'm going to give, I've been asked to give a talk about skills development and economic growth, and it will be quite general. I will perhaps focus a little bit more on England because it's the country that I know best. And the things that I will talk about are skills and economic growth. Well, the main topic of my talk, to show you that there is a relationship and to show you the evidence for that. I'm going to talk about issues about the supply and demand of skills. And then I'm going to talk about a few select research and policy challenges in this area. So to start with, this is a graph which I think nicely depicts the relationship between skills and economic growth. The skills here are maths and English test scores in international tests, and the data were gathered between 1960 and the late 2000s. So on the horizontal axis you have the test score, and on the vertical axis you have the growth rate, the GDP growth rate between 1960 and the late 2000s. And you can see there that there's a strong positive relationship between those two things. So, for example, if you're to move 50 points on PISA, you would increase your GDP by 1 percentage point. So that's quite a strong relationship. This is conditional controlling for other things that may confound that relationship. For example, it's controlling for the initial level of development in a country. And the authors, of course, it's very hard to establish causality in these studies, but the authors have tried to deal with that insofar as possible, to suggest that at least some of this relationship is a causal relationship between skills, investment, and the economic growth that you can expect to achieve later. The other point that the authors make, this is Eric Hanushek and Ludger Vosman who did this work. The other point that they make is that the relationship between actual achievement, that is skills in maths and science, is much stronger than the relationship between years of education and economic growth. If you were merely to look at the relationship between years of education and economic growth, the relationship would be a lot weaker. So it doesn't matter just how much time you get people to spend studying, but you also need to worry about the quality of what they actually learn. I realise this is a conference about vocational and professional training, but I still think that we should think about these maths and science and underlying scores, because if people haven't got the capability in those areas, that they're unlikely to be able to get to the very high level of vocational and educational professional training that's actually needed to secure strong economic growth in the future. Now, if you're a country like the UK, you're doing kind of average for the OECD in terms of education, and probably around, well, below average these days, probably in terms of growth. But really, our problem in the UK is a very high share of adults with low skills. You can be an average performer and you can still have too many people in your country that have very low skills. So this next chart comes from the OECD PIAC study, which is about adult skills after age 16. And it's looking at the share of the population with literacy and numeracy skills below level 2. Now, skills below level 2 is very low level skills indeed. It is really finding it difficult, for example, to understand how to read the instructions in the back of a packet of medicine. So it's very, very bad indeed. And the darker bar on the chart is how the percentage of adults, 55 to 65-year-olds, the share of those people with below these levels of skills. And the lighter bar is 16 to 24-year-olds, the share of those people with low level of skills. And as you can see, in almost every country, the share of young people with low skills is much lower than the share of older people with low skills. And this suggests a massive improvement over time, that most countries are doing much, much better in getting their populations to a basic level. And a huge issue within England and also the United States is that we're not showing that same rate of improvement, and we have a lot of young people in this category as well. And of course that has implications for economic growth as well. It has implications for inequality. And we see that more and more people are skilled and there's a high return for education. And yet there's a lot of people who are effectively disenfranchised from that because they don't have good basic skills. I don't think it's any accident. I do think there's a relationship between these things and populism within these countries and great social unrest, which does, I think, curb growth as well. So in countries such as the UK, which I don't think would be the case somewhere like Hong Kong, but you have a lot of people with very low basic skills and not enough with good intermediate skills. We have shortages in medium and high skilled occupations as well as in certain low skilled occupations. So how do we find this out? We have an employer skills survey where employers are asked to talk about the skills that are in short supply. And you can also look at the list of occupations to which people can apply to come to the UK if they're outside the European Economic Area. And a lot of those things that are in shortage are in engineering and in health, in skilled manual work and professional and associate professionals. And if you ask employers about the skills that they're lacking, they talk about certainly very specialist skills, but they also talk about some general skills like problem solving and numeracy, and things like teamwork and management as well. The result of all of those supply problems is that there's a lot more dependence on migration than people in the UK government would like, and yet they can't really reduce migration without putting at risk essential services in the country because we simply don't have enough people who are skilled to the right levels for the demands of the labour market in the UK. So what underlies the increase in demand for skills? Well, we heard a good bit about that earlier. A lot of economists have focused on two hypotheses, really. What's known as skill-biased technological change and globalization. And they've been trying to figure out, well, which of the two is it? What's more important? Is it that technology is changing very fast and therefore demand for skills are rising? Or is it just being part of a globalized world? Do you have to specialize more where there's more trade? And actually, both of these explanations have a role to play in explaining why the demand for skills have increased. But the most evidence would suggest that skills-biased technological change is what matters, and that it's pervasive across different countries. That's technologies that are changing in a way that's complementary to skilled workers, but that tends to substitute for unskilled workers. So an example would be, for example, bank clerks being replaced by automatic teller machines, but then people are needed to operate the machines. Engineers are needed to operate the machines. So it's not that you're destroying jobs only. You are destroying some jobs because they're being substituted by capital, but you're creating the demand for other jobs, and these other jobs that where the demand is being created are very often for high-skilled jobs. A part of the consequence of this is that the wage returns to skills are high across many countries, and that they've increased despite the fact that we have much more people who are able to supply those high skills. Actually, the return, that's the amount of money that employers are willing to pay for people, has risen or stayed the same or hasn't decreased. And you can see, if you look across countries, that there's a lot of variation in the wage returns to different skills. Andreas Schleicher talked about Singapore earlier, saying that they were people who had a lot of digital skills. Well, you can see that they're also the country that has the highest wage return to numeracy skills. So even though they're supplying a lot of skills, clearly the demand is very, very high there too. And the demand is high in all of these countries. These authors that have looked at, tried to understand the pattern in the wage return across countries, show that in fact it's countries with high levels of prior economic growth that have where the highest wage returns to skills. Another manifestation of changes in the labour market is this polarization. This is two colleagues of mine, and the title of their work, this particular piece of work, was Lovely Jobs and Lousy Jobs. And the idea being that the demand for lovely jobs has increased and lousy jobs has increased, and it's a disappearing middle that's a big problem. So what the chart shows is, what they did was they looked at all of the jobs, all of the occupations in the economy in 1979, and they divided them into deciles. So each 1, 2, 3, 4 is a tenth of the workforce. And the decile, the quality the job is defined by the median wage within those jobs. So the lovely jobs are the jobs that pay very well, and the lousy jobs are at the very bottom, they pay very badly. And then they looked at the employment change over time across all of these different jobs. And what they found was an increased share at the very bottom and a much bigger increase in share at the very top. So, and then a decline in the middle. So we have a decline in sort of intermediate jobs, and a very big increase at the high end and an increase at the low end. So what does this say about the sorts of education that need to be provided? It shows that there's a lot more demand for high-level skills than there used to be in the past, and that's not going away. It's showing that the labour market changes in ways we can't predict and should change within our own lifetime. It's suggesting that technology is a great force for that change, and it's not terribly predictable what's going to happen. Therefore, you need to enable people with the sorts of skills that are going to equip them for life in a changing labour market, that they're going to have to be able to need to retrain, to reinvest through the working life. So, although you want people to have specialist skills, it's important that that's not at the cost, that you don't sacrifice those more general skills that they also need. So, of all the things that you could do, I mean, there are so many things that you need to do in education to try to improve its quality. You need to have the curriculum right, you need to have the infrastructure right, you need to have the accountability right, and the leadership right, and the expenditure as well, because it's all expensive. The one issue that a lot of economists focus on, and where we're mostly in agreement, is the importance of teacher quality in education generally. That if it's one thing that you could do to improve the quality of education in schools, it would be to improve teacher quality. there isn't that much robust evidence in economics that I know of that looks at this specifically in the context of vocational and professional education. But I don't think that we could possibly think it would be any different there, except possibly the more challenges there. For example, people needing to have some experience outside teaching to be able to bring that into vocational and professional education. In the literature that looks at teacher quality, one of the interesting findings is they say, although teacher quality is shown to be important, very important for influencing educational attainment, it's not the measurable, observable characteristics of teachers that actually matter. So, for example, the degree classification of teachers doesn't seem to correlate very well with how good a teacher they actually are. So one has to be careful, I think, about professionalization of the workforce and insisting that people have more and more degrees, because that's not necessarily going to get you to the point that you want, which is you want to have really high quality teachers in the classroom at whatever age. So research and policy challenges are how to attract and retain good teachers, and whether good teaching can be taught. So what are the pedagogies that can be used, and can we get robust evidence on what pedagogies can be used? In England, one of the things that has been done is that there's something called the Education Endowment Foundation, and they fund people to look at particular interventions. For example, one thing that they've decided to look at that I'm involved in is looking at contextualized learning. So this is learning in maths and English for people who are in vocational colleges, but that in England, vocational education is difficult because it's not, often you're doing some remedial education as well. Often the people in these colleges are not equipped enough in maths and English, and you are doing some remedial education too, which complicates the whole thing relative to schools. And what they're asking is whether, well, would people be able to learn their maths and English better if it was more contextualized to the vocational subjects they were actually working in. So the pilot that the Educational Endowment Foundation have decided to go with is to look to see whether this might work, and if it might work, then to do a full impact evaluation. That is where we'll come in and do a randomized control trial, and we'll have some people some institutions that are given the intervention and some institutions that are not given the intervention, and we'll try and look afterwards at how much students improved, whether this was a useful pedagogy or not. Another challenge in this area that economists are very interested in is the balance between general and vocational education. And the benefits of the vocational education are particularly that there's a clear line of sight to work for students, and it may help them integrate better into the labour market and ease the school to work transition. So many people find countries that have good apprenticeship systems have lower youth unemployment rates, for example. Now, the downside of that is that sometimes in those countries, those people who've been in vocational education also are unemployed later in life and find it hard to retrain and reinvest. So there's a potential trade-off there. How do you deal with that? Well, one of the ways in which you can deal with that is to try to make sure your vocational education isn't too specialist too soon, so that you do incorporate general education into that as well. Otherwise, you might be doing young people a disservice in the long term if they can't invest in the skills that they need to when the labour market changes, as it inevitably will. One of the things that we're working on is apprenticeships and trying to look at, there's a big drive towards apprenticeships in England, and we're looking at apprenticeships vis-a-vis classroom learning to see whether there's much added value for young people in England. Now, of course, this is always going to be something that's very context specific. Apprentices in England are very different to apprentices in Germany and Switzerland and many other areas. And the apprenticeships that we have in England are often fairly short, for example. minimum of 1 year, whereas in most other countries, apprenticeships are a minimum of 2 years. And one of the privileges about working in our centre is that we do have access to really good data, so we can link people through school into college, into their education, and into the labour market. So we can track them through their whole trajectory to see what happens to them. And these are graphs where we've done this. This is for a group of students. Now it's all students in the state education system that did their GCSEs in 2003. And we're looking at it separately for males and females. And we're looking at people with a maximum of level 2 or level 3 education. That probably doesn't mean that very much to you, but level 2 would be people who can get the GCSE exam, the sort of who do okay, and that would be a level 2, and level 3 would be high school. So we're not talking about very high level vocational education here. But within England, most vocational education isn't high level vocational education. But our question was, do you see much a differential, earnings differential for people with an apprenticeship with this level of education versus people who don't have an apprenticeship? And the findings suggest that it's a very different story for men and for women. So if you look at the access, the lines for men, you can see that, for example, the yellow line shows vocational education and training at level 3 with an apprenticeship, and the red dashed line shows vocational level 3 without an apprenticeship. And actually there's a big gap between the two for men. And that's true when you condition on other characteristics as well, when you control for everything as well. And for women, it's a completely different story. There doesn't appear to be much long-term benefits to having an apprenticeship, and they're much lower paid in general. Now, a lot of the story, when we go into it, seems to be the types of education that vocational education that men and women do, where there's a much greater dominance of men in sectors like engineering, which seem to have a high wage return and which are fairly long apprenticeships. And for women, there's a lot more people going into health and social care and retailing, which doesn't tend to have as high benefits. But I think what it illustrates is that we need to be a bit careful about thinking that having an apprenticeship is going to be a very prosperous, a very good outcome for everybody, that we have to be careful to think that, well, it may be more beneficial in some sectors than in others. But here I'm speaking in a very English context, and of course it may be different in other countries. So other research and policy challenges, is it necessary to incentivize employers, and how do you do that? Some people would say employers really have an interest in investing in skills themselves because they recoup the gains. Now, it's clearly true that even if there was no government subsidies, employers would invest a certain amount in skills. However, maybe they don't invest enough. And within England, we've seen that employers, in fact, have invested less in skills over time in their workforce, and that's a really big concern. So, and clearly this is going to be more important for transferable skills, because employers will want to invest in the skills that are going to benefit them, but not necessarily going to benefit their competitors. They're simply going to poach people after they do their training. That's the fear. So in England, the way that the government have decided to do things now is introduce an apprenticeship levy, which is a tax on large employers, which they can then recoup by investing in apprenticeships themselves. That's the way they'll get their money back. It's too early to say what effects this is going to have. It does come with significant risks. There's a limited amount of research that looks at the impacts of incentivizing employers through these ways, and often it finds a very substantial deadweight cost, which is that you end up subsidizing employers for a lot of things they would do anyway. And that's why it's important to to evaluate things, because if you don't evaluate things properly relative to a counterfactual, you don't really know if it's worthwhile or not. And then you have to make some calculation about as to whether the inevitable dead weight is still worth it because of the extra skills that are being invested in. That's an empirical question, and it's the sort of question that we would like to address within our research group. The London School of Economics have done a Growth Commission report about how do you try to improve growth in the United Kingdom, and one of their recommendations was to use the tax system. In other words, employers have an incentive to invest in capital. Can you give them tax incentives to invest in people as well through skills? There has been some empirical work in the Netherlands to look at that, whether that had an effect, and they did find some impact on investment in skills. I think I put what support is needed for adults because I mean this is not something for which there is really great research evidence, but it's a very important issue for both policy and research, because one might imagine that the sort of support needed for adults is not the same as the same sort of support needed for young people. But if we're serious about lifelong learning, we have to really try to address that and to think about things like that, and also to think about things that can be evaluated, so that we're not just left with kind of anecdotal evidence about what works or not. We really want to have hard evidence about what works and what doesn't work, so that we can learn from it. And the final slide is I just wanted to show you what apprenticeships look like in England, because it's very unusual. Apprenticeships in most of the world are considered a policy to improve, for young people, but within England it's actually a policy that since 2008 has been taken up more by people who are over 25 than under 25, so more adults. And it's an open question as to whether that's been beneficial or not for adults, and that's something that, again, with data we can try to look at in the future. But I have a few minutes for questions now, so I think I'll stop.